We will start. Right. Welcome everyone here in Jordan Center. Welcome people online. My name is Tatiana Limpoeva. I'm an associate professor of history, the history department at NYU, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Nikolay Tsyrempilov, who is an associate professor at Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan. Professor Tsyrempilov will be also a visiting scholar for the next couple of weeks here at the Jordan Center. And some of you will have another chance to meet him at the ACES next week, where we will be at the same panel talking about Buryats. Professor Tsyrempilov is, as I mentioned, associate professor, and he is a scholar of Mongolian and Buryatian history, as well as history of late Imperial Russia. He is an author of numerous publications, and most notable one in English, titled Under the Shadow of White Tara, published by Brill in 2021, and that is an English translation of a Russian edition, right? Or it's an improved his latest publication is an article which he co-authored with Irina Sadnomova, titled "How Did Lamaites Became Buddhist? Buddhist Modernism in Late Imperial Russia," published this summer by a Critica journal. And I'm sure this talk is related to that article, right? Based on that article. Yeah. Exactly. And another publication I would like to mention is also recently published, Бурятские летописи, which are translated into Russian language by Zhargal Badagarov and edited by Nikolay Tsyrempilov and others. Yeah. This is unfortunately not widely available, but I also would like people to know that Russian translation of Бурятские летописи exists, and you can approach me to ask for a copy or something, because now I'm an owner of this wonderful book. All right, welcome, and
thank you. May I talk standing? Right?
Yeah.
This is my habit. I have lectures sitting. Continue? Oh,
there is a stand.
Why not? Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the Zoom audience. I see a lot of very prominent listeners, I know, and whose interest I appreciate a lot. And of course, my special thanks to Tatiana for, first of all, for inviting me to New York University to spend here a couple of weeks. It's a really great and brilliant opportunity for me. I'm also happy to see here people who some of you came from other cities, and it was a very pleasant day today. Yesterday, when I arrived in New York, it was cold, and the gusts of cold winds reminded me my current hometown, Astana. Today, weather improved considerably, and I really enjoyed today. I'm sure you as well. So, as Tatiana already told you, my talk will be based on our recent article that was published finally by Critica. It was written by me and my younger colleague Irina Sadnomova from Heidelberg University. And the talk will be focused on the phenomenon of Buddhist modernism in late Imperial Russia. You know that in Buddhist studies, among the experts of Buddhist history, Buddhist modernism is one of the very hot topics. And Buryatia was almost never considered as the very interesting and bright case of Buddhist modernism. I will talk a bit later what I understand by Buddhist modernism, what is usually understood by Buddhist modernism. And by the way, this is the name of our article. As you can see, it was published quite recently in summer 2024. My personal interest in Buddhist modernism began, like I think in the case of many other scholars and researchers, from this book by Bechert Heinz, Buddhismusstaat and Gesellschaft in den Ländern des Theravada. Buddhism is, I think that the entire interest to the phenomenon of Buddhist modernism starts with that remarkable book. And that book was focused on Theravada, on South and Southeast Asian countries. And I believe that until now, most of the studies of Buddhist modernism are focused on that Asian region. Although in recent decades, a lot of important case studies focusing on Japan and China were also published. But again, as I said, not only Buryatia, but even Tibetan Buddhism is rarely considered as the cases of Buddhist modernism. So what makes Buddhism modern? I think it's easy for you to understand what makes Buddhism modern by looking around. I'm sure that a lot of you know people, your friends, your colleagues who are followers of different forms of Buddhism. And I cannot say for all of those cases, but too many of them understand Buddhism in a modern sense. So they usually are not very much sensitive towards the ritual side of Buddhism, stressing more on reason, empiricism, and I would say scientism, right, of Buddhism. So a lot of people believe that unlike Abrahamic religions, unlike other religious traditions, Buddhism is more compatible with, say, Darwin's theory of evolution or Big Bang theory or whatever, right, the theory of relativity and so on and so forth. Then, of course, the modern Buddhism is much more egalitarian, and hierarchies are not very much prominent, right, like in, say, traditional communities. And the gap between, say, monastic segment and a lay segment is almost, I would say, insignificant in modern versions of Buddhism. And of course, it's much more individual rather than communal. It stresses the figure of the Buddha Shakyamuni as the founder of Buddhism, which actually was not the case with traditional communities, where the figure of the Buddha Shakyamuni was overshadowed by different cosmic Buddhists, Buddhas, different bodhisattvas, deities, and so on and so forth. As a prominent American Buddhologist once mentioned, Tibet remained relatively isolated from the forces of modernity, of modern Buddhism, in part because it had never experienced European colonization or direct European domination. And indeed, due in part to its relative isolation, mainly both in Asia and the West considered Tibet to be a pure abode of Buddhism, unspoiled by the forces of modernity. But I come from the idea that Tibetan Buddhism, of course, is not restricted to Tibetan region, right, and even to Mongolia alone. And some Tibetan Buddhists, some followers of Tibetan Buddhism, definitely experienced European colonization and domination of European system of knowledge, Christianization, missionary activities, and so on. And Among them are my own people, the Buryats. So my talk will primarily be focused on the case of the Buryats. So what attracted my attention to the issue of Buddhist modernity among the Kalmyks and Buryats are a petition that I have found a few years ago in one of the Russian historical archives. And as you can see, the Buryat and Kalmyk activists, Buddhist activists, in those documents were especially unhappy with the fact that in late Imperial Russia, Buddhism still was considered as idol worship. And in a petition on the eve of the announcement of the new law of religious tolerance or freedom of consciousness that was followed in 1905, Kalmyk and Buryat Buddhists claim that this fact deeply insults their religious feelings. They were also against the term Lamaism, which they considered imprecise, unfair. Lamaism coming from the term Lama, which is only term for denoting a Buddhist priest, actually confuses the external observers, because the doctrine of the Buddha himself is the root of this Buddhist tradition, and so it's much more fair to refer to their religion as Buddhism. So this brought me to the question, to a few questions, as you can see on the screen. Why was it critical for Buryats and Kalmyks to secure the official ban of the term Lamaism in 1904? Why was it important to them to be recognized as Buddhists? Why were they unhappy with the term Lamaism? Why were the Russian imperial officials reluctant to grant this permission? And how does this situation actually reflect the processes that were happening in the Buddhist communities in late Imperial Russia? So, starting with those questions, I would like first to give you a short, brief facts about who were the Buddhist followers in the Russian Empire. Most of the Kalmyks and Buryats were classified as Lamaites, right, or Lamaiti in Russian. According to 1897 census, there were a bit over 400,000 followers of this religion, which actually constituted less than 0.5% of the entire Russian population. As you know, the Russian Empire was a confessional state, which means that each and every subject had to be affiliated with certain religious community. And most of the so-called Lamaites or Lamaiti were living in Astrakhan, Stavropol, Irkutsk, and Amurov, Priamursk, right, provinces. The Russian Lamaites were indeed often referred to as idol worshippers. This, however, doesn't mean that they were equaled to or equated to pagans, by which Russian imperial officials understood the followers of different animistic and shamanistic beliefs. The Russian officials clearly realized that so-called Lamaism is much more complex and a better organized form of religion with the religious centers outside the Russian Empire. They were aware that the neighboring Qing Empire is officially patronizing Lamaites, and so this, of course, elevated the significance of this religious system in the eyes of Russian officials. Yet, until the late 18th century, there were no unified term for the followers of this religion. So diverse terms were used. You can see them in historical documents like Lamskaya Vera, Lamский закон, Lamskaya суеверие. The term Lamaism seems to be coined by German researchers employed by the Russian Academy of Sciences in the 18th century, Johann Fischer and Peter Simon Pallas. And if Fischer used the term Lamaist followers, it was Pallas who first used the term Lamaism, right, the abstract term to denote the entire religious system. So here is the citation from his travels throughout the provinces of the Russian Empire. It was published in I think 1770s. Of course, there are also versions that the term Lamaist comes from the Chinese Lama Jiao, which was first used by Qianlong Emperor in one of his edicts. But chronologically, the term Lama Jiao comes after the Pallas first used the term Lamaism. My talk is not about the understanding of who was first, who holds the primacy of using this term, but I believe that it was probably Pallas who used it earlier than Qianlong. As for the term Buddhism, it has its own history. The term Buddhism emerges in the early 19th century, and first before the classical form of this term emerged, there were different diverse forms, like you see on the screen, like Buddhism or Buddhism with double O. But the term, of course, came along with the overall conceptualization of Buddhism as one religion, umbrella term which hosts a lot of various Asian traditions, which before that were not considered as belonging to one root, to one founder. I should also say that Lamaism was viewed as a rather corrupted or degraded version of Buddhism, simply because it contrasted a lot from the so-called classical or authentic traditions of South and Southeast Asia, because of this tantric exoticism and so on. Lamaism was considered as a blend of local shamanistic beliefs with Buddhist ideas. And this understanding of Lamaism or Tibetan Buddhism probably was influenced by the Jesuit and Capuchin missions in China, who were especially prejudiced against Tibetan Buddhism. So in Russia, Lamaism was considered as a sophisticated and organized form of shamanism. And you see on this slide the title page of Catherine the Great's play, right? Not everyone knows that Catherine the Great, Russian Empress, was a prominent playwright, writer. And one of her comedies was called Shaman Sibirsky. And if you read it, you can easily recognize a lot of characteristic features of Tibetan Buddhism in it, which came probably from her personal acquaintance with the first Pandit Lama Zayev. I believe that he's the main character in that comedy. So Catherine the Great believed that her Kalmyk and Buryat subjects are following are merely sophisticated form of shamanism, but in reality it is the same crude and primitive religion, which is kind of antinomic, right, or opposing the whole idea of the European enlightenment, European knowledge, and so on and so forth. But ironically, it was Catherine the Great who first recognized Lamaism as a tolerated confession. And for that, she's still worshipped by the Buryats as an earthly embodiment of the female deity White Tara. Just quite a couple of, I think, months ago, a new statue was inaugurated in Ivolginsky Datsan. You see it on the screen, where Catherine the Great and the first Pandit of Lama, Damodar Zayaev, are standing, looking to each other. And this symbolizes the embrace of Lamaism by the Russian Empire. Indeed, in 1764, the Buddhist administration is established in Transbaikalia with Pandit Lama as chief Buddhist priest. At the same time, a lot of restrictions were imposed on Buddhist community, including the banishment of all contacts with the core religionists of the Qing Empire. It was never strictly observed, and the Buryats were part of this bigger Tibetan Buddhist world. They performed regular systematic pilgrimage tours to Lhasa and other Tibetan Buddhist sites. A lot of Buddhist lamas got religious education in Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist monasteries. Buddhist perspective. So we were discussing how the term Buddhism emerged as the European construction. Like all isms, Buddhism is a European construction. But what Buddhists themselves, how they considered themselves, right? How they placed themselves within this bigger Buddhist Asian world. Regional Buddhist communities of Asia, for the most part, lacked a sense of unity until the late 19th century. It doesn't mean that bigger, broader, kind of inter-regional Buddhist identity never existed. Not at all. However, it most likely disappeared in the early first millennium CE due to a lot of complex reasons, like advent of Islam, then the formation and domination of the Hindu traditions like missionarism, Shaivism. All this led to the gradual decline of Buddhism in India, and a lot of Buddhist shrines denoting the remarkable sites of historical Buddha were left in oblivion until the 19th century, until the British archaeological discoveries of these sites. So the Tibetan Mongolian Buddhist tradition historically as well perceived their religion only as a unidirectional transmission line coming from the ancient India. By this I mean that the broader Buddhist pathways to other Asian regions like China or Japan were rather ignored in Tibetan Mongolian Buddhist tradition. I mean, even within one Qing Empire and earlier within the Yuan Empire, the Chinese Buddhists and Tibetan Buddhists didn't have a sense of belonging to one religion, right? Even administrative units that curated the affairs of Tibetan Buddhists and Chinese Buddhists were different, okay? Never mixed. And so this fragmented reality is what characterizes the Buddhist communities, regionalized Buddhist communities, until the advent of the era of Buddhist modernism. This is, by the way, the kind of schematic representation of how Tibetan Mongolian Buddhists understood the lines through which through genealogical lines that connected different teachers and their followers, reincarnation lines that represented transmission of Buddhist tradition of Tibet and Mongolia. And Buryats were considering themselves as the final recipients of this alliance, having a sense of mission of promoting Buddhism to the north, promoting Buddhism in the gloomy land of northern countries. So factors that determine the advent of Buryat Buddhist modernism, as I already mentioned, include two major things, in my view. The first one is the early contacts with European Orientology, European Oriental studies, academic Buddhist studies. I think Buryats engaged with this academic world of Buddhist studies earlier than most of other Asian peoples. And the other important factor was, of course, systematic and repeated assaults from the Orthodox Christian mission. The idea of the missionaries who denied Lamaism to be a real religion, calling it superstition, labeling it superstition, a marginal sect, or simply a corporation of parasites who impoverishing their own followers, the Buryat population. The Christian mission repeatedly tried to convince the Russian authorities on different levels that Lamaism has to be simply banned because it does not meet the criteria for real religion. And so there will be a little danger in simply banning, right, in ousting the Buddhist lamas from the Russian territory. Russian officials, for the most part, were thinking otherwise, and so Buddhism managed to survive. But of course, for the Buddhist lamas were living with this constant idea that their position in the Russian Empire is very shaky. And with the new wave of Christian assault, with the, say, coming to power of more conservative officials, it is very likely that they may perish as the distinct Buddhist, as a distinct religious community. So this atmosphere of criticism and danger instigated or prompted the Buryat Buddhists to defend their position, right? So, not sure how should I return that, because is there any way? Oh, well, yeah, no, it was. Yeah. So however, the attempts of the Russian missionaries, Orthodox missionaries, to undermine the position of Tibetan Buddhists in Buryatia and Kalmykia led them to reconsideration of their strategy. And this reconsideration was due to the engagement of the Orthodox missionaries with the academic circles. One of the major intellectual think tanks of Orthodox Church was the Kazan Theological Academy, which was very closely associated with the Kazan University. A lot of you know the figure of Osip Kovalevsky, was one of the earliest Orientologists who promoted the term Buddhism in the academic world, so in Western Europe and in Russia as well. From the mid-19th century, one of his disciples, the prominent Orthodox missionary Alexei Bobrovnikov, gradually brought the other missionaries to the idea that they have to recognize that Buryats and Kalmyks are Buddhists. Missionaries accepted this fact and changed the strategy of dealing with the issue of Lamaism in Kalmykia and especially in Buryatia. So from the mid-19th century, they gave up the attempts to completely ban Lamaism, but rather started demanding to normalize the corrupted Buddhism of the Buryats. And I will elaborate on this in more details a bit later. So, Wojciech Kovalevsky and his school of Buddhist studies influenced not only Orthodox missionaries, Russian Orthodox missionaries, but even Buddhists themselves. As it is widely known, the first Buryat scholar and one of the earliest non-European scholars with a scholarly degree, Dorje Banzarov, was a very close disciple of Osip Kovalevsky. And as we know, he defended his thesis focused on Siberian shamanism. However, of course, he had scholarly interest in Buddhism as well. Recently, an American Mongolist and Buddhologist, Matthew King, in his monograph, and his recent monograph, discussed how Dorje Banzarov developed his interest in Buddhist studies, in contemporary Buddhist studies. One of his achievements, not so well known, was translation of the travel notes of the 4th century Chinese pilgrim Fa Xian into Mongolia. And the Fa Xian is famous for describing Pax Buddhica as it existed before the decline of Buddhism in India and Central Asia. His dynamic travel notes reveal the more or less unified Buddhist world of his time. And Banzarov was really fascinated with this story. He translated Fa Xian's travel notes from French into Mongolian, and that translation subsequently was translated into Tibetan and became a factor and became one of the elements of Tibetan Buddhist historiography. So this is a fascinating case of circulation of knowledge, where not only Buddhist traditions were providing basic knowledge, right, to the Western academia, but also when Western academia becomes the source for the traditional Buddhist knowledge. The limitation, time limitation, forces me to quickly skip to the late 19th century, to the formation of St. Petersburg Buddhology, which is primarily associated with academician Fedor Ippolitovich Sherbatsky, or Sherbatskoy, who at the turn of the 20th century introduced a very innovative approach in his studies of Buddhism. He was he and his followers were the earliest academics who began to be very close and tightly engaged with the Buddhists themselves. Fyodor Sherbatskoy, and especially his disciples, his students, spent entire few seasons in Buryatia learning from the Buddhist lamas. And another prominent person in this phenomenon was Agman Dorje, who made a fascinating career at the court of the 30th Dalai Lama, and he was a great enthusiast of this context with European and Russian Buddhologists. So a lot became possible through his mediations, through his very enthusiastic help. So these interactions were not particularly hierarchical or asymmetrical as, say, in ethnographic studies, because St. Petersburg metropolitan Buddhologists very often found themselves as petitioners, right, as a humble followers of the Buddhist masters. This is what Vera Tolz has shown brilliantly in her very influential monograph, right, Russia's Own Orient. So this collaboration was mutually beneficial, and Buddhists themselves also benefited a lot from the collaboration with the Russian Orientologists. For instance, one of the main results of this collaboration was the construction of the first ever Buddhist temple in European Imperial capital, right? All of you know, the very famous St. Petersburg temple, which was possible for the most part through the active support of St. Petersburg Buddhists. Returning to the criticism coming from the missionary flank, I have to say that I already mentioned that missionaries began to criticize Buddhist communities in Kalmykia and Buryatia through comparing and contrasting the form of monasticism they were observing in Buryatia with the kind of classical or authentic Buddhist forms, which they learned about from the Victorian Buddhology. So one of the most stern critic of the Buryat and Kalmyk, especially Buryat Buddhist Archbishop Veniamin Bogdanravov, was claiming that the followers of the Buddha must liberate themselves, not by prayers, but through self-purification, mortification of senses, and comparisons to all living creatures up to self-sacrifice. So Archbishop Bogdanravov positioned himself as somebody who knows what Buddhists should do better than Buddhists themselves, and was prescribing the Buddhists what they have to do to kind of deserve the status of real Buddhists. Despite kind of ridiculousness of this criticism, it worked, and Buddhists themselves reacted to this criticism, and this criticism contributed a lot to the Buddhism reformism that was initiated by Lama Zondarjeev, whom I already mentioned. So in one of his notes that I have found in one of the archives, it's in Mongolian, originally in Mongolian, he claims that Russian scholars of our time hold high opinion concerning the teaching of the Buddha. Seeing our lifestyle, they can think that what we follow is indeed not the Buddhist teaching, but some other religion. So what Agam Darjeev is discussing here, and this is one of the earlier pamphlets of Agam Darjeev that initiated the reform in Buddhism, is that he considered the Buddhist monastic standards in Buryatia rather lax, right, and called for making it stricter. And for that, he, like Veniamin Bogdanravov, contrasted the Buddhist tradition as it existed in Buryatia to the authentic earlier forms of Buddhism of the Buddha Shakyamuni in ancient India. So we see that under the influence of European, Western European Buddhology, both Buddhists and Orthodox Christians are contrasting existing Buddhist community with the ancient past, and idealized and ancient past. So here I would like to briefly give you the features of the Buryat Buddhist modernism. And among them are increased interest to the ancient roots of Buddhism and personality of the Buddha Shakyamuni. Indeed, Agam Darjeev himself was responsible for publishing a few popular versions of the life story of the Buddha Shakyamuni. One of them was specifically for Buryat kids, children. He called, I mean, Buddhist modernism, not only Agam Darjeev, but also his like-minded followers called for reformation of monastic life and return to the ancient simplicity. They attempted to reform monastic education by introducing secular subjects. For instance, Agam Darjeev was the proponent of introducing such subjects as, say, geography or physics. He believed that lamas must know the achievements of modern science. So he attempted, he and his followers attempted to establish pilgrimage routes to India. I will talk about that a bit later. They made emphasis on ethical aspects, rationality, and scientism of Buddhism in the spirit of modern Buddhists. And of course, they collaborated actively with academic Buddhologists, specifically with Sherbatskoy's school. And these developments in the Buryat Sangha are very much similar to what was happening in other Asian countries, like, for instance, in Japan or in Ceylon. In Japan, the Buddhist practitioners, Bunyo Nanjo and Kenji Kasahara, for instance, made a very famous trip to Oxford University, where they were studying under Max Müller, studying Sanskrit and Pali languages. Well-known fact how theosophists Helen Blavatsky and Sir Henry Olcott impacted the Ceylonese Buddhist activists, and specifically Anagarika Dharmapala, and how they contributed to the rise of the so-called Protestant Buddhism, which shares a lot of features with the version of Buddhist modernism we observe in Buryatia. I was fascinated with the case of the Buddhist discovery of the larger Buddhist world. The documents show that the humble Lama, the 11th Buryat humble Lama Yeroltuyev, traveled to India twice in 1898 and in 1901. In 1901, for instance, he used the new steamship route that connected Vladivostok through Nagasaki with Bangkok and India. So humble Lama Yeroltuyev took that route to undertake pilgrimage in Buddhist India, and this definitely expanded the understanding of his personal understanding of the larger Buddhist world. A very interesting episode is that Lama Yeroltuyev and Anagarika Dharmapala attempted to establish the permanent systematic contacts with each other. And with the Mahabodhi Society, Mahabodhi Society was the first Pan-Asian, Pan-Buddhist international organization. So Ceylonese Buddhist activists were very much enthusiastic about this systematic contacts with the Russian Buddhists. But the documents show that the Russian officials, Russian diplomatic circles, and then Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Internal Affairs, were actually in agreement that these contacts may be pernicious, right, for the Russian interests in Asia. So they had to curtail these contacts, and they actually resulted in nothing. A few words about the attempts of the Buryats to export the version of Buddhist modernism to the neighboring Outer Mongolia. And this is connected with the activities of a lay Buddhist modernist Tsyben Zhamtsarano, who attempted to publicize and realize his Buddhist ideas and plans in Mongolia through the first Mongolian newspaper, Shinotoli, or New Mirror. So what he did, he translated and published Leo Tolstoy's Life of the Buddha, in which Leo Tolstoy expressed some mild criticism towards the contemporary Buddhist, traditional Buddhist communities. And also he published some articles on scientific geography and physics in his newspaper. He also initiated a project of establishing a Buddhist academy for lay Buddhists, in which the students had to study not only Buddhist works and treatises, but also such subjects as geography, physics, chemistry, and so on and so forth. However, those plans were never supported by the Mongolian Buddhist clergy. Moreover, under the pressure and due to the protests from the ecclesiastic Buddhist circles, the Russian consulate had to close the newspaper. The newspaper was sponsored by the Russian consulate. So the Buryat attempts to export the version of Buddhist modernism was unsuccessful. The Special State Duma's Commission for Religious Affairs in 1906 arranged a whole series of discussions of the Buddhist issues in the wake of the 1905 Edict of Toleration, and as a response to the petition of Buryat and Kalmyk activists to ban the term Lamaism and official introduction of the term Buddhist. So the term Lamaism was replaced with the rather awkward term of Buddha-Lamaism. Most of the commission experts agreed that Tibetan Buddhism strongly deviated from pure Buddhism, and so it is inappropriate to call it Buddhism. Some pointed to the fledgling pan-Buddhist ambitions of the Buryats and Kalmyks, comparing them to the ideology of pan-Islamism. So they considered those developments rather unpredictable and dangerous for the Russian Empire. And also the issue was, of course, seen in the context of the lost war with Japan and the Yellow Peril discourse and the apprehension that Japan in the future again may use this Buddhist factor in the geopolitics. Yet the term Buddhism from that time on gradually began replacing Lamaism, and immediately before and after the 1917 revolutions, it becomes normative. Not only Buddhists themselves use it, but if you open the newspaper articles or different popular journal articles, you find the term Buddhism ubiquitous and much more oft used than the term Lamaism. And this brings me to a kind of conclusion, or rather a few follow-up remarks. I hope I have some time, right? Yeah, just 1 or 2 minutes. So the idea of authentic Buddhism was common in Fender Circle European society, and it served as a point of reference for the assessment and stigmatization of vernacular Buddhist traditions throughout the Asian British Empire and Russian Empire as well. So the Russian Empire's reluctance to recognize the Buddhists' right to determine the name of their own religious tradition was, among other things, motivated by their political fears. So they considered this drastic change of terminology as a way to politicize the Buddhist issue, right, and make the Buddhist issue kind of more important than it deserves, let's say. For the Buddhists themselves, the name change meant deliverance from the old colonial stigma associated with the term Lamaism, which was used primarily by Orthodox missionaries to label their religious tradition as deviation from pure Buddhism. So they viewed Buddhism as a channel through which they could connect to a broader Asian setting, and so viewed themselves not only Russian but also Asian. Buddhist modernists strove to strengthen Buddhist position in the imperial system and facilitate the acceptance of their faith as a respected world religion, not as a marginalized, spoiled, degenerate Buddhist sects, but rather a part of the great Buddhist international Buddhist heritage. And yet the term Lamaism obtained a new life in the words of Soviet scholars with a negative connotation as a tool by which Imperial Russia had oppressed the colonized Buryats and Kalmyks. So just a couple of words to explain this. As I said, immediately after the revolution, the Bolsheviks were very actively using the term Buddhism, and Lamaism was almost completely out of use. But after the Bolsheviks launched the large-scale reprisals against the Buddhists, just like all other religions in the Soviet Union, the Lamaism, the term Lamaism, again, was very much demanded. Right now, as I said, it was used as the religion that contributed to the colonial oppression of the Buryats and Kalmyks. And even nowadays, the term is quite popular in Western scholarship, in Russian scholarship in particular. And if you just Google Lamaism, you will see a lot of contemporary articles using this term. But I think that nowadays it is mostly a kind of habitual practice. Artifacts of the Soviet religious studies, artifacts of Soviet criticism of religion and Buddhism. I don't think that people use it as consciously, right? In this way, singling out Tibetan Buddhist tradition from the overall international Buddhism. Thanks a lot. This is all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to discuss.
All right, the floor is open. So also for the online audience, you can either raise your hand and we will unmute them, right, to ask a question, or you can type your question in the chat box and I will read it. Right, so any questions? Yes, James. Maybe you introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi, I'm James Metter from Columbia's Harriman Institute. So I have two questions, both of them pretty different. First question is just to expand a little bit more on the last point about this sort of Soviet era revival of the term Lamaism. When you had said that it had gone out of fashion, I thought immediately, well, it's like Gerasimova, like people like this. Can you just speculate a little bit on sort of what the chronology of the Soviet revival of the term was as you understand it? And then second question is a much bigger one, and it's sort of, I don't know this literature very well, but I know this sort of Central Asian states has all of this research on the Jadidist movement, and just sort of wondering if you have any sort of thoughts about that movement as a point of comparison for what you've described today.
Yeah, sure. Two excellent questions, actually. And the first question about the revival of the term Lamaism in the Soviet science. It is memorable for me how I actually discussed this term with Gerasimova herself, who was a very strict proponent of the term Lamaism.
She said that we should use Lamaism.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was trying to kind of to question the validity of the term, she was very much stern, saying that you're stupid, you don't understand anything. Lamaism is a valid term because it shows the peculiarity of Tibetan form of Buddhism. So she was, I mean, of course, she, in some respects, she was correct. She simply dismissed, or maybe was unaware of this colonial legacy of the term. And I think a lot of people in Russia are rather resistant towards the portrayal of the history of Buryat and Kalmyks in Russia as a colonial history. A lot of colleagues disregard this overall thesis, right? It's very popular in Russia to claim that Russians contributed to the progressive development of ethnic minorities and so on and so forth. So I don't mean that Gerasimova kept this in her mind, but she simply defended kind of the scientific appropriateness of using of this term, because she was using it for her entire career, and of course she was not ready to so easily surrender, right? My point was that if you read the Soviet works on Buddhism in dated by late 1930s, you see this very sudden shift from Buddhism to Lamaism, when the ideology dictated the scholars that now it's time to criticize the religion. So I'm not sure whether it was a kind of centralized decision to use the term Lamaism, but you find it everywhere. Suddenly, beginning from 1930, maybe 35, 36, you see that the term becomes extremely usable, right, in the Russian scientific, the Soviet scientific production. So I think it is because it had this negative connotation, and Soviets simply used it to strengthen their thesis that religion is evil, and Lamaism is the kind of terrible system that is partially responsible for the deplorable situation in which Buryats and Kalmyks existed in Russian time. Yeah. And your second question, about Jadidism. Yeah, I simply had to skip this part from, of course, living in Kazakhstan, where Jadidist legacy is so strong. Yeah, we often discuss Jadidism as a movement in my classes with my students. Of course, I draw the parallels between this version of Islamic modernism in Russian Empire and what we observe in Buryatia. They were not connected, too isolated, I would say, independently developing phenomena in Central Asia, in Volga-Ural region, in Transbaikalia. I believe they were not connected because the Buryats and let's say Tatars and Kazakhs simply didn't have a common platform for discussing these ideas, right? But the factors that brought both religious groups to the kind of reconsideration, the traditional standards of existence, right? The conservative position towards their religion, of course, were common. And the same factors as with the case of Buddhism, like collaboration with the academic circles, and then necessity to defend their religion from the assaults of the dominating religion, contributed to this reconsideration of the religious traditions. Jadidis were mostly focused on reform of the education system, right? Introducing the new methods of teaching Islam in madrasas, while Buddhists also paying a lot of attention to the educational standards. I would say were much more focused on the idea of raising the standards of monasticism and the relationship between monastic segment and lay segment. Yeah, this is the difference between them.
So we have a question from Christopher Atwood. I'm sorry, Christopher.
Can you hear me now?
No, we cannot hear him.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute him, but.
Could you unmute this?
Well,
Can you hear me?
Hello?
yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry, Christopher, we cannot hear you.
Oh,
So, wait.
Oh,
Hello?
Hello? Yes, can you hear me now?
No.
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 Oh, maybe,
I'm sorry, Christopher, we cannot hear you. They can hear him on Zoom.
Yeah, but we have to reload it and do the word, and so sorry about that, but, sorry, we have problem with the machine, so if
Please,
you
Vernon, you should
type.
Type in your question, reach out.
Okay, so we're going to another. Okay, okay, all right, so, there is a question from Anton Yermakov online, so he has two questions. First one, can you think of, you also can read it if you want to, can you think of any Buddhist figures that might be described as counter-modern in the vein of Matthew King's take on Zavadamdin in Mongolia?
Yeah, it's a very good question, which I mean, I disregarded this aspect in my talk. That of course the Buddhist modernists faced a lot of resistance in their own community, right? Because a lot of more kind of conservative lamas were considering their initiatives for reformation of established rules in monastic community as the attempt to undermine Buddhism as an attempt to depart from the long-standing tradition, right? And we know that this opposition between modernist and conservative tendencies gained momentum in the kind of early Soviet time, when Buddhist, so-called Buddhist obnovlenцы is the term that was never used before the Bolsheviks came to power. And definitely the term that was simply borrowed from the Orthodox Christian vocabulary, right? No, православные обновленцы. So the opposition between these two groups reached its apex in the 1920s, when in some cases it even brought to the physical brawls right, between each other for the control of certain datsans. And then both parties were so opposing to each other that they used the Soviet regime as the arbiter in the discussions. The Soviet regime actually practiced here the divide and rule strategy, gradually bringing the whole Buddhist Sangha to the large-scale conflict around the datsans. So yes, of course, I think I would even say that the majority of Buddhist lamas were conservative, because Buddhist modernism represented only, I wouldn't say insignificant, but still a small minority. They were very much powerful before the revolution, mainly because of the incredible statue of Agwan Darje, because he was the one who made an absolutely unprecedented career in Lhasa for the Buryats, I mean. And his authority, of course, made the modernist project very efficient and successful. But after the revolution, I think the Buryat conservatives managed to integrate into a formidable force that definitely made the life of modernism uneasy. I would say not that much comfortable.
Okay, so Anton asked another question, and it seems that Christopher Atwood's question is similar. I mean, close. Okay, so Anton asked, what do you make of the history of Mongol pilgrimages to Mount Wutai in China? These pilgrimages predate the rediscovery of Buddhist sites in India by about a century, though they can still very much be called a modern phenomenon. So you argue that, you know, it started with the discovery of Indian sites.
Yeah.
But what about the Mongol pilgrimages?
But I think that the pilgrimages to Wutai Shan were very much traditional for the Tibetan Buddhists in general. I think that Wutai, 5 peaks, were I don't know actually exactly the background history of how it began, but I think it goes back to the quite early traditional times. And Taishan remained as the very holy and sacred site, as the abode of Bodhisattva Manjushri for a long time. So I don't consider it as a part of kind of modernist tendencies.
Yeah, so I think Christopher can clarify. It's so unfortunate you cannot speak, Christopher. So I will try to read, and I hope my pronunciation is good. So it's rather like Anton's second question. I don't see the idea of a common Buddhist identity to be so purely modern as was briefly presented, as you mentioned in your talk, Nikolay. In the Mongol Empire, Tibetan and Chinese monks were understood as both being in the Toid, in the Buddhist monk category. Like Tibetan and Buddhist is one category,
Right,
yeah.
right.
And the Xuanzang Yuan administered both, right? Both Chinese and Tibetan. Similarly, in the Qing dynasty, Duke Gombajap's Janak Choyinjung expounded Chinese Buddhism as a part of the same karma as among Chinese and Tibetans. Right, so maybe not the separation was not as clear cut. So, but he agrees that this idea is very, in some sense, marginal. I wonder why you think they did not have so much influence.
Yeah, those are very excellent comments. Of course, I was aware of Yanak Choyjung. I'm not sure that I clearly understand the system of religious administration in Yuan China. I know that Phagpa Lama was actually the main authority in religious studies, and definitely the Chinese Buddhists were also under his control. And this is a fair comment that that probably my thesis that Chinese and Tibetan Buddhism do not consider themselves as belonging to one religious tradition is probably too far-fetched. But it is indeed also true that these tendencies, these feelings did not have a kind of lasting impact on the Buddhist identity, right? As we see in the Qing era, the Chinese and Tibetan Buddhists lost this sense of common identity, and the rise of Chinese form of modernism, right, associated with Taishu, was actually kind of innovation, right? When Taishu was calling for the kind of more attention that Chinese Buddhists had to pay to Tibetan tradition, it was perceived, I think, by his contemporaries as something new, right? Something innovative, and that what also constituted a part of Chinese modernism. Maybe again, I'm not entirely correct, but this is a very good question for discussion, right? A lot of actually things that I have not, that I have downplayed in my talk. So I'm very much happy to get this insightful comments from Professor Ahmed that will probably force me to reconsider some of my points.
You speak louder here.
Hello, my name is Brigitte. I'm from Inner Asian Alpine Studies program at Harvard. So I also have two questions. I'm interested in Tibetan medicine history in Russia, and I was wondering how this modernist concept is also find itself in Tibetan medicine, as Tibetan medicine was kind of unique tradition for religion to have its own medical system, and it was always like bordering on history of science or history of religion, and people couldn't quite distinguish to which one it belongs. There was the same confusion in Russia at that time, because at that time the Soviet medical system wasn't developed yet, so they had no other choice but to only rely on Tibetan medicine for local people. And it also was something that was drawing people to Buddhism because it was also providing medical healthcare for people. So, and then that come to modernize Tibetan medicine. The Advan Rajiv also wanted to teach Tibetan medicine in a more modernized way.
As a
and
part of
philosophy and stuff like that. But it was also clear that we cannot really separate Buddhist ideas from medicine. And so otherwise it would not be like a lot of its logic is also very much ingrained into the medicine itself. So, and this similar problem was found with Chinese medicine. Also, like, how do you integrate Chinese medicine into modern science? Like, because a lot of its logic is not, it cannot be proved by scientific laboratories and stuff. Yeah, that's the first big question. And the second one is on monasticism. Because I remember one Rajiv, he kind of like either he found the number of the first Kambala Mathayev.
He wrote.
Yeah, so I couldn't quite grasp like whether he like just invented it or like whether it was written and then he rewrote it. Pointing out his numerous initiations into the monastic vows, like specifically for monks. So he wanted to bring back the monastic pluralism, but then in modern ways, we don't really have a lot of full monks. We mostly have the lamas, but then now Dalai Lama is also concerned with this purity, right? Because most of the monks have families, and we see also new masters who are in Nyingma tradition. We think that maybe like for Mongols, it's better to be in Nyingma tradition, where you can be lay person and also not secular religious master. So maybe that's more suitable for Mongols because they can really hold monastic vows. So that was.
Yeah. Both are excellent questions, and I think that the factor of Tibetan medicine is definitely underestimated in my analysis of Buddhist modernism, although it's a very important factor because Tibetan medicine in many respects resembled the scientific systems, right? It was based on empirical findings and so on, and Buddhists definitely used Tibetan medicine as the evidence for the scientific nature of Buddhism and so on. And we know that Tibetan doctors of Buryat MCs were very much prominent in the Russian Empire. Everyone knows Pyotr Badmaev, but even more prominent is his brother, Suitin, who participated in the coping with the epidemics of I don't remember, was it Rishnoy tif or something like that, right? And for that he was awarded by the Russian Empire and was not alone in doing that. You know that Buryat MCs were very much popular and demanded by the Russian population in Transbaikalia. I came across a lot of petitions of Russian villagers asking the authorities to not to get rid of some Buddhist MCs who were killing the Russians because Russian imperial system considered it illegal that Tibetan doctors are killing Russians. So yeah, and then we know about the experiments with Tibetan medicines that were taking place in early Soviet period, right? So there were a few articles about those experiments. For instance, one of the lamas, I don't remember his name, Gambazhakov or Gamboyev, was even sent to Saratov for one of the hospitals where he achieved tremendous results in curing the patients that were hopeless, right? So, I think Ivan Sabrin wrote a few very important articles about the role of Tibetan medicine in the early Soviet period. So yes, I think Tibetan medicine is one of those cases which can make this thesis on Buryat, purely a Buryat version of Buddhist modernism even more appealing, right? We have to look close into it. And your second question about the monastic discipline, yeah, I'm very much grateful that you mentioned that biography of the first humble Lama Zayaev, originally composed by Ivan Drozhiev himself. In the colophon to that work, he claims that he wrote this based on some certain accounts that he had found in the Tsongol Datsan. But I believe that it was his version, right? And he used it as a pamphlet to show that actually we Buryats had such a figure as Zayaev, who was a proponent for the strict monastic discipline. And then as for the Nyingma tradition, that could be probably more suitable for the Buryats, I can say that it is also the realities of the Gelugpa tradition that a lot of lamas are actually not monks, right? They are married. It happens in Tibet, in everywhere. In Buryatia, out of 15,000 lamas, only a tiny minority were actually monks. Most of them were so-called steppe lamas, the Stupni Lama, right? Who were living in the isles together with their families, who were offering the religious services to the lay people, and at the same time having wives, having kids, and there was nothing extraordinary in them, right? By the way, it was one of the
They should hear us now.
Can you hear us now?
Can they?
Yes, now.
Great, awesome.
So, we have like around 10 minutes left, Nikolay, but we have 3 questions. So we can like, make it, quickly go through them. So, first one, or 2 questions. First one is from Leah Shear, and it's related to the question on Tibetan medicine, but also about Buryat-Kalmyk relationship. And I also just had the same question. So thank you so much for this informative talk. I'm a history graduate student at Princeton, working on late Imperial Russia. I have a question about Buryat-Kalmyk relations that also echoes Sukhjit's previous question. In your presentation, Buryats and Kalmyks are regarded as a united group petitioning to the Imperial Russian government. I wonder if there were any tensions or hierarchies in this collaborative effort. I ask this because in my own work on Tibetan medicine in this time period, I noticed that a Kalmyk Lama emphasized Tibetan medical texts, quote, religious and mystical tinge, and quote, while in Buryat, Dr. Badmaev's translation, he explicitly attempted to present it as a totally scientific by quote, sidestepping everything related to Buddhist mysticism. Right, Kalmyks emphasizing religious side, while Buryats emphasizing like it's scientific. So I wonder if we can fine tune these different approaches to how to revamp traditions in the modern context.
Yeah, very interesting question, very important one. Indeed, Buryats and Kalmyks represented one unified group while petitioning for the banishment of the term Lamaism. However, of course, it's the later developments, and in earlier times, they were not that much closely connected with each other. And as Professor Shorkovitz, right, from Germany believes, Russian imperial system did its best to actually keep the affairs of Buddhists, of Buryat and Kalmyk Buddhists separate, to avoid kind of uniting their local potential, I would say. Right? So indeed, Kalmyk religious affairs were mostly administered by the Ministry of State Domains, while the Buryat Buddhist tradition was in charge of Ministry of Domestic Affairs. So does not mean that the ties between Kalmyks and Buryats, divided by huge distance from each other, was not exist. Not at all. If we look closely into the sources, we see that there were some pilgrimage tours of Kalmyk noblemen to Buryatia. We see that in the early 19th century, Russian authorities even promoted these ties, asking Buryat lamas to help Kalmyk lamas with the Tibetan medical techniques. I know the sources, and for example, I think Governor Treskin, who was facilitating these contacts. So these contacts were rather random and unsystematic, but the close collaboration between Kalmyk and Buryat Buddhism were facilitated primarily through the mediation of Ivan Rajiv, who, spent a lot of time among the Kalmyks, trying to raise the Buddhist awareness, trying to establish the new schools, so on and so forth. So I think that this new page in the history of Buddhism in Russia brought to life this declining context between the Buryats and Kalmyks. As for the mentioning of this different approaches to Tibetan medicine, I think we cannot make very general observations, right, concerning the understanding of Tibetan medicine in the Kalmyk and Buryat communities. I mean, a lot is explained by personal understanding of Tibetan medicine. So I cannot say anything specific about it.
Okay. So next, no questions from here? Yeah, okay. Sorry.
I'm from Kalmykia.
Oh.
My name is Aglar Bugdaeva. I work on the Kalmyk epic Tangar, and also I'm a sociologist by training, and so I studied Mongolian Tibetan studies at St. Petersburg University as an undergraduate. So I wonder whether the experience of modern Buddhism is a little bit different in Buryatia because of the distance from the metropole compared to the experience of the Kalmyk Buddhists in Kalmykia, because we are so close, and we are so we get this almost like a direct impact of the colonial policies, especially from Catherine the second. So there are two people, Catherine and Stalin, who will never have the monument in Kalmykia, right? Because Catherine II, she ended the Kalmyk Khanate the
Yeah.
sovereignty of the Kalmyk Khanate, and as a resistance to Catherine, Kalmyk left Kalmykia, and this was like part of the destruction of the Khanate and the population. So the entire period of Catherine's regime had such an impact that the Kalmyks perhaps did not want to become to experience her style of modernity, because she, on the one hand, she tried to show that she supports the French Enlightenment and modernity, but at the same time she tried to distract, especially the southern ethnic minorities. So yes, so the question is, because of that, such a proximity to St. Petersburg, do you think there are different attitudes to even wanting to become so-called modern? Because for Kalmyks, it's possibly the project of the colonialism to become modern. So they would resist to become modern. They would resist to become maybe married monks and try to be more like closer to what they call this ancient Buddhism.
Sorry, because we have a 5 minutes left, so I will collect questions. You have, and it's yours, your question.
Hi, I'm Gareth. I'm an undergraduate student from NYU, and my question is about the impoverishing perspectives of the Tibetan Buddhism by the Chinese and Russian, Imperial Chinese and Russian states in an earlier stage. So actually, I have two sub-questions. The first is for the Chinese side. You said that the Chinese would consider the Tibetan Buddhism as a less developed version of Buddhism, and they even created a term Lamajiao, sort of to distinguish it from the more conventional Buddhism by the Qianlong Emperor, Qianlong. But why the Qing dynasty also treated the Tibetan Buddhism as the national belief? Is there like a conflict between this negative attitude towards the Tibetan Buddhism and the this priority given by the court? And on the Russian side, my question is, you said the Russian commissionary and the state treated Tibetan Buddhism as a more developed version of shamanism. And I'm just want to compare it to the shamanism of the Uralic speaking ethnic groups in Western Siberia. For those people, did the Russian state and commissionary treated them differently, thinking that for those people, their local shamanism was more developed due to their whiteness, because by appearance they are more like European compared to the Mongolian people. I'm just wondering, does race also have a say here? And that's my two questions.
Yeah.
Sorry,
My name is Valentina. I'm graduate from Buryat State University. And there is a tradition in Buryatia to give a name to the children according to what the Lama said, which name is possible. My great mother got a Tibetan name, and it was Bamboo. Does it mean all names in Buryatia have roots from Tibetan region in common? I mean, usual names, and why some names are common, and this name, I never heard this name besides my great mother anywhere else. So then later she was changed her name according to Christian Valentina. Now I'm Valentina, and if I want to go back to Bamboo, would it mean that I go from Soviet name to with Tibetan name? But my point, I want to come to Buryat names. Should I take any other common name like
I did not say that because Bonjour, I don't know, it's more, yeah, when I say foreign.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, Nikolay, we are dropping on you all these questions because we are really out of time. Maybe you can discuss names after, after the talk. So our last question is from Edward Kai online, and it's about influence of Japanese Buddhist modernism. So some of Taishu's and Chinese Buddhist reform ideas for education were influenced by robust Western scientific studies already prominent in Japanese Buddhist and academic spaces in Edo and Meiji periods. There were also parallels in traditionalism. So the question is, were Buryat or inner Asian Buddhist communities influenced by these, I suppose, Japanese sort of modern Buddhist ideas in their educational reforms?
Well,
Right, so very quickly,
yeah, very quickly. Those questions all are great, but they are so advanced that I'm not sure that I actually can answer them all. As for Kalmyks, it's a very interesting question, which may bring someone to the special research, right? The attitudes of Kalmyks towards colonial legacy. And, I'm not sure that we can actually call the Catherine the Great's enlightenment ideas is very much modern. Maybe I'm wrong, but but I think that I don't think that it is really dependable on different colonial experiences of Buryats and Kalmyks. I think we have to focus more on what they shared, and both of them shared the marginal status of their religion, endangered, shaky positions of both Kalmyk and Buryat Buddhism in the Russian Empire. I think that what made them close, and this is why they aligned their interests. As for your question on the Lamajal, again, it's a kind of food for thought. I mean, how Chenlun, what was his attitude towards Buddhism? We know that the Manchu elite were followers of Tibetan Buddhism and officially patronized Tibetan Buddhism, but we also know that there were a lot of political implications in Chenlun attitude towards Tibetan Buddhism. He considered that lamas may clear and it may undermine actually the empire, may stand behind some rebellious intentions of and this is also what has to be taken into consideration. As for the racial connotations of the hierarchy of shamanisms in the Russian Empire, it is something absolutely new to me. I didn't know anything about that, and I think it's worth further investigation. What was that about? Yeah, it's interesting. The influence of Japanese intellectual reformist movements on Buryat. I don't know anything about that except the fact that Gandhi was traveling through Japanese territory. He stopped in Nagasaki. He wrote a lot of complimentary things about Japanese as the people, but he didn't say anything about any Buddhist modernist ideas of contemporary Japan. Hiroto also, of course, traveled through Nagasaki. I don't think we have to overestimate the influence of Japan on the Buryats. I know that some Buryats prisoners of war were kept in Japanese concentration camps, and they were treated well. They were allowed to attend some Buddhist temples, as far as I know, but I cannot name this particular source, so I've just heard about that. And as for the name Bamburu, I actually am very much interested in Tibetan names among the Buddhists, because unlike the Mongols, Buddhists have a higher percentage of Tibetan names. And your name, I cannot recognize it, right? I thought that I know each and every Tibetan name that Buddhists have, but Bamburu is something absolutely unknown to me. But I think, yes, There's a whole story about how Tibetan names found its way in Buryatia and why they still keep this immense popularity among the Buddhists. And there are a lot of names that have their origin, a lot of names of origin. There's a lot of stories about it. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss it. But thank you for your questions. It's very interesting.
Well, thank you so much. And let's hope that there will be more of such topics, on Siberia and other ethnic minorities at Jordan Center. This is not our last, so please, audience online, follow our events. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.